Hello, and welcome to Sojogo's webinar, DEI Unleashed, Crafting a Cutting Edge Strategy. My name is Oscar Gomez, and I'm your presenter and facilitator today. I am also the CEO and founder of Sojogo, a professional services firm. We specialize in DEI strategy and leadership development with a DEI lens and emphasis. So I'll tell you a little bit more about Sojogo at the top of the presentation, but why don't we jump in and look at an overview of what we will cover. So as I mentioned, we're going to tell you a little bit about Sojogo, a little bit about our services, but more importantly, our approach and our frameworks that really make us a little bit different and stand out and effective. We'll also look at a working definition of strategy and different types of strategy so that we can reference throughout the webinar. We'll then look at what is DEI strategy. What is the traditional DEI strategy framework, which can be effective, but what we propose is a little bit limiting, right? Because there's so much more potential of what DEI strategy can be, and that's what this webinar is about. From there, we're going to look at sort of some of the frameworks that we look at that can really unleash DEI as a strategy, right? And they include cultural humility, DEI and storytelling. Also, we'll talk a little bit about narrative change, narrative building. Then we'll look at DEI and data knowledge management, which is really key, especially when we're talking about advancing health equity, advancing racial equity, and also in terms of how to be an effective people-centered leader. We'll then look at some equity frameworks. We'll tell you a bit more about that. And then we're going to look at sort of the applications. When we look at these frameworks and then with the strategy, what are some of their applications in an organizational setting to include human resources, C-suite leadership, and DEI and branding. So about Sojogo, you'll see some of our services here. Well, primarily, if you want to think about us as sort of a C-suite level services, chief diversity officer, in the case of health organizations or sort of nonprofit civil rights groups, would probably fit more under a chief equity officer framework. But we provide interim and fractional services. To that vein, some of the sort of standalone services that we offer are still in that vein of sort of a C-suite level approach. Leadership development, like I said, treats, talent, recruitment, retention, and management strategies, board development, strategic planning and design. And our approach, what makes us unique and effective and really, I think, stand out in this increasingly crowded field. We really harness and really tap into the power of storytelling, which storytelling is about people and it's about transformation. And storytelling has been a part of civil rights movements, social justice movements, and so it has a definitive role and impact in DEI work, DEI strategy. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Our approach also includes peer-to-peer information exchange and adult learning principles, unlike sort of traditional training. And then we'll look at cultural humility frameworks, which is really the framework that we lean into, recommend, and promote. And then finally, what really stands out about our approach is that we have hands-on applied executive business experience versus academic frameworks and compliance frameworks, which have their role and their place, but I feel have really sort of boxed in DEI and sort of created some of the misunderstanding and backlash that's out there. And essentially, just given our background of 25 years in community and public health, 16 of those years as chief executive officer, that really is what we lean into and make Sojogo different in our services. All right, so let's jump right in. So what is strategy? Here's what you'll generally see as sort of the traditional pyramid for strategy, right? It begins with mission, vision, core values. All these are important, right? But then we get to strategy, right? Which comes right after the intangibles, if you will, but right before you get into the actual the action steps. And in short, strategy is the how to achieve something, what is the approach to those objectives, and it's really what sort of carves out a lane that also builds on your existing assets, acknowledges your limitations and challenges, and has really done a scan of what the competitive environment out there, what the opportunities and challenges are, which you're familiar with that SWOT. So that is what we're really going to focus on today, as opposed to DEI training or compliance, right? We're going to look at really as what is DEI strategy and how to unleash that potential. We talked about the how-tos of strategies. It's also important to look at sort of the different types of strategies in an organization and sort of where DEI comes in. You'll see here we've identified corporate strategy, and corporate strategy essentially defines the overall direction an organization or a company will take, right? I guess the most common process or document or deliverable for corporate strategy is strategic planning, right? This is where you're going to have an array of stakeholders contribute to that plan. Oftentimes, it's a board of directors, your C-suite leadership, maybe some senior leaders, invited stakeholders, what have you. But that is corporate strategy. So it's the top level that's going to influence your overall direction. Then there's business strategy, which is probably, so if you're not going to engage in strategic planning with that DEI lens, you're going to look at business strategy. And business strategy, a good way to think about it is that it's a strategy for a specific department or unit or component of your business, right? So it could be your sort of your whole HR team, right? The recruitment, retention, talent management, what have you. And then we also propose that in terms of healthcare organizations, social service providers, and maybe even some policy groups and civil rights groups, business strategy and DEI, this is where strategies around advancing health equity or advancing racial equity, this is where they would fit most effectively under a business strategy, right? Because you're going to measure a certain function of your organization, if you will. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Uh, and I just sort of contradicted myself there, but saying functional strategy. So what we mean here, this is sort of this a little bit goes to the how to's. Functional strategies are applied at the operational level, right? So a functional strategy, let me give you an example, would be in your hiring process. So your functional strategy would be how are you going to look at how are you going to change the strategy around recruitment and the onboarding and hiring process, right? As opposed to your entire HR department. So that's a little bit of a distinction between the two. So this is a traditional DEI strategy. And again, this is very effective and it's adopted by a lot of organizations and companies of all sizes and increasingly in different sectors. And as you look at here, it's looking at, it's comprehensive. It addresses education and training, recruitment and hiring. Then it goes into retention and development. And then if we're looking at sort of to really support all of these other components, it's important to look at the policies and practice. In other words, how is it being institutionalized in your organization? And of course, as with any other strategy, there's an assessment and a planning component to it. So this is what you're probably, if you've delved into DEI strategy at an organizational level, this is probably something that a version of this that you've seen, that you're familiar with, that you've adopted. And depending on sort of who's leading this, who your point person is, who your strategist with this, you'll experience different levels of success and effectiveness with this. We certainly promote this strategy. It certainly has its place. What this webinar we're trying to convey is that there's so much more to DEI strategy when you bring in just a DEI lens in its full comprehensive context. It can really expand beyond just this traditional approach. So let's get into that. So in order to do that, really to unleash, to go beyond this traditional DEI strategy, there's some frameworks that really help do that, right? And this is what this webinar is going to go into a little bit. There are either DEI strategic frameworks and or approaches, and the ones we will cover today briefly include cultural humility, which I mentioned, narrative change, and storytelling. While they go hand in hand, they are slightly different strategies and frameworks. And so we're going to discuss them. They're going to be kind of blended, but we're going to try to make a distinction as to when you would bring one of those strategies or approaches and when you would bring another. And then there's finally, there's knowledge and data management. So we're not going to explore all aspects of data management because that's a very comprehensive framework, but there are some components in that framework that can really help unleash and advance your strategy with the DEI lens. And then finally, we're going to look at equity frameworks, right? And this equity, we're looking at in the context of what we understand equity to really be. And that is really, equity is based on disparities. It's based on data. And it's really about acquiring, distributing, redistributing, and sharing power. And so we'll look at that a little bit. All right, so let's look at cultural humility. Cultural humility is essentially, it's a framework that stands apart from cultural competence, right? Cultural competence is really more of a skill-based training, and its assumptions are that there's a finite amount of knowledge to get around culture, and that makes you competent. Cultural humility takes a completely different approach. It's not about skill sets, and it doesn't presume that there is a finite amount of knowledge. Instead, it really focuses on three pillars. The first being that there's a lifelong commitment to self-reflection, personal inventory, and continuous learning. Two, and this is what we referenced earlier, that cultural humility requires a recognition of power dynamics and imbalances among individuals and or institutions. And this is really key because I think some of the newer DEI practitioners, when I mean newer, say of the past 5, 6, 7 years, we don't see a lot of, we see that missing a little bit, right? And it's really a core component, the role of managing, distributing, and yielding power, right? Because in the end, power is what really changes and uplifts communities, addresses disparities, what have you. We'll go into that a little bit more. Finally, the pillar of cultural humility, the third one, is that cultural humility requires an indefinite commitment to institutional accountability. So if we look at these three things together, the first pillar is really, it postulates that it's about the person, it's about us as individuals and the commitments that we make to to do self-reflection, inventory, and to continuously learn, not just about others, but about ourselves, right, in this professional development. We talked about sort of that link of being power dynamics. And then the third pillar, how it relates to the others, is that it says, you have these two things, but to really sort of have this be institutionalized and effective, it requires an institutional commitment. So also, just I want to say, if you want to look up more around cultural humility, it's really popular in the healthcare sector. I think more and more medical schools and nursing schools have adopted it. We're seeing it more in among social service providers. So we have a short webinar on it. It's like, I think, a 15, 20-minute webinar. But if you want to learn more, you can Google that or just reach out to us. All right, we talked about narrative change, right? This is such a powerful tool and framework to really unleash DEI. Narrative is essentially the big story that's rooted in shared values and themes that influence how people process information and make decisions. So it's a collection of stories, right? And so I'll tell you about narrative change. Narrative change then is a strategic approach to shift into sort of how to shift stories that guide our values and shape how people make meaning of information and experiences. I think the key things to think about here in terms of narrative change strategies, or narrative building as it's also called, is that these strategies, to show its effectiveness, this is what many of the civil rights movements from the 1960s were based on. That's what made them so powerful, transformational, and really that have longevity. They're still sort of happening today, and there's a strategy that's being adopted. If you look at narrative change strategies, were adopted by the 1960 civil rights movements, by the LGBTQ community shortly after Stonewall. Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement really adopted narrative change strategies. It's basically saying we're going to sort of take control, redirect, and really put out our own stories to define what these movements were about, what these communities were up against, what their visions are, what their hopes are, etc. Right? And again, we feel free to reach out to us. We'll tell you more. In fact, we're going to be having a webinar about this later this month, and you'll be seeing some more promos around that. But that's narrative change strategies, and we'll talk about it more. But narrative change can be really effective in policy and advocacy work, and also branding and or positioning, storytelling strategies. So we talked about narrative change, right? But just storytelling as a strategy. Let's get back to sort of what a story is. Stories have the ability to create shared emotional experiences between the storyteller and the audience. That's based on a protagonist's desires, dilemmas, fears, and or choices. It connects people. In fact, what I have found really in adopting a storytelling strategy and storytelling steps, in not just in this DEI work, but in terms of team building, in terms of my leadership roles in the past, is that when we really listen to other people's stories, right? When we truly listen to their stories, we begin to identify and see elements of our own stories and of our own narratives in theirs, right? And that's where the power and effectiveness of storytelling as a strategy can really be seen. Now, in a business or operational setting, it can be applied to management or analytical tools to use to promote, engender, and inspire leadership development, team building, and brand awareness. There's so much to do. So, I mean, just think about sort of that connection. Uh, I know I'm going to go off subject a little bit here, but it's an example that popped into my head. There's a lot of some of the DEI training that happens that we've seen out there. It can be effective, but it's really selling itself short if you really bring in storytelling to team building, right? What you're looking at is really you're having people connect on an emotional and genuine and authentic level, right? As opposed to just looking at skill sets or this sort of widget of information. For the next framework or approach to really unleash DEI as a strategy is data knowledge management, right? We're going to really focus on three of these components, right? We're not going to look at data security so much or data pipeline automation because those are more technicals, but we have this graphic here because that is sort of the full comprehensive view of what data knowledge management is. Real quickly, knowledge management is it really refers to sort of institutional knowledge, organizational knowledge, sort of how is that documented, captured, how does that live on. Data management really refers to how data is collected, how it's packaged, how it's analyzed, how it's presented, gaps in data. There's so much in there, right? But the reason we really promote data management as a tool to unleash DEI is because, first and foremost, if you're looking at advancing health equity or racial equity, both of them are data driven, right? Because they both are talking about disparities. If you're looking at health equity, you're looking at disparities in health. If you're looking at racial equity, you're looking at disparities in socioeconomic factors, right? And data is at the core. And so, really having a more strategic and sophisticated approach to data knowledge management can really help unleash the potential of DEI in a variety of areas, to include policy and advocacy, to include even sort of how to expand it into a new consumer market or a new service area, if you will, if you're a healthcare organization, right? So a couple things to share about data knowledge management and DEI is that, when you look at DEI and data as a strategy, what you're really looking at is you're going to really focus carefully on what is some of that data missing. What is data that's missing? How is it packaged? As you all know, data itself is objective. It's neutral, right? But it also has a point of view, or it can have a lean or a bias, right? Depending on how it's presented, depending on what's collected, depending on the integrity of that data. So DEI, if we're bringing a DEI lens with data, is that you're going to really look at that carefully. You're going to invite and encourage different questions to be asked, right? You're going to say, well, hold on. What if we take these? What if we connect this sort of information and data with this information data? What is that going to tell us? What if we started collecting? Are there groups here that we're not collecting data from, right? That can tell us more and give us a more accurate picture. The most effective example I can share with is in the healthcare sector, which is sort of where I had my career for 25 years. And if you think about it, in the healthcare sector, really data knowledge management and DEI is so core, because if you don't look at data as a strategy in DEI, you can create things what I refer to as echo chambers, right? So if you looked at, say, data from urgent care or emergency rooms, right? And you're getting sort of what are people presenting at? What is the data of people that are coming in to receive urgent care or emergency care, even primary care. If your data is solely based on those people, then you're essentially going to create what I call a data loop or an echo chamber, because what you're capturing is data on people that are already accessing care, whether it's on a primary care basis, consistent, or a one-off emergency care. It's still only reflecting data of people already accessing care. You're not capturing data from people that have not accessed care, that have not sort of had an access point with the healthcare system, right? That's the best example to share how, to illustrate how a strategic approach to DEI and data can really help unleash and really look at other frameworks related to this. And again, towards the end of this webinar, we will identify some of its applications, where in your organization can be most effective. So we have here equity frameworks. I encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide, because it's a lot to cover here. But basically, if you look at here, equity frameworks, strategically are not just about, better said, looking at salaries or benefits or salary packages, which I think has been what's popped up or has become sort of a view of what equity is in terms of organizational settings. And it's not. I mean, that might be a sliver of what it is. Equity frameworks are really, again, they really speak to power and the how power is acquired, how it is shared, distributed, redistributed, right? And so equity frameworks, when you're looking at it in terms of DEI, you're looking at it from 4 different perspectives. You're looking at equity frameworks from an individual, right? So those are really a person's beliefs and actions. And in that column, you'll see different steps that you can take, whether you're a peer or whether you're a leader. And that's really where it's most effective, right? For leaders to look at their roles as an individuals and advancing equity, right? Then there's the interpersonal frameworks, right? What can be done in terms of when we are relating to others in a workplace setting. Equity frameworks and institutions. That's really where we speak to policies and practices in organizations. And the traditional DEI strategy references this, but it doesn't, in our opinion, go deep enough, right? Because it doesn't look at equity in the context of power, right? Which is, again, what we feel is really missing uh, in some of the newer DEI strategies and newer DEI services. And then finally, equity frameworks in a structural setting. And that is the effect it has across institutions. And this is so important, right? Because this really speaks to not just institutional racism, but structural racism, which is not really what we're talking about racism here, but in terms of quality of care, in terms of looking at aligning your values around them. Structural equity frameworks are so important. It's also known as structural competency, and there's some organizations that are doing great work around that. In fact, my former employer, where I worked at for 27 years, is doing some great work around structural competency. Health Outreach Partners, you can Google them and see what they're up to. Alrighty. Now what we're going to do is really look at some of the applications that we've talked about. We've looked at the approach and how to unleash DEI strategy. This is not exhaustive, but these are 3 of the main areas of where you can really take these DEI frameworks and approaches to really unleash their potential in your organization or company. And the first is human resources, right? I tried to reference or at least connect where some of these frameworks and approaches where they apply in your organization. But let's get more specific here. These frameworks really can help with professional development and learning, right? Especially if you're looking at equity framework, storytelling and narrative change is really effective there. Talent recruitment, retention, and management can be really effective. I think that is, if you look at some of the frameworks around equity frameworks, would really have some connections to this. Employee staff experience onboarding, orientation, retention, storytelling, and equity frameworks can be really key here. And again, so what we have here is people strategy. Over the last, I'd say 5-8 years, maybe, the role of the chief people officer has really emerged, really sort of taken hold in many organizations, which is great, right? And so chief people officers sort of are in that human resources component, right? So if you're not going down the route of hiring a chief people officer, or that's not in your foreseeable future, you can really, if you have a DEI lens with your human resources department, you can really start leaning into that people strategy. And what that basically means is that um, it's an acknowledgement and a commitment that um, the talent, your staff, are your most valuable resources, and that the whole experience of your staff, from the recruitment process to developing them as professionals, and even when they leave your organization, that relationship they have with you, that is probably the most effective way to really tap into the power of your most important um, resource, and that is people, your staff, right? And so some of the frameworks that really help there, again, go back to narrative change, go back to storytelling, some of the equity frameworks, cultural humility in particular. And finally, when you have this approach to this, is that you can really look at how DEI and human resources, you can become an employer of choice where people want to come work for your organization, right? In a previous post that we had on LinkedIn and some other social media, we talked about sort of millennials and Gen Z, and how so much of the data is showing that younger workforces. When I say younger generations of workforce, again, it's Gen Z and millennials. You know, um, it's really important to them who that the company that they work for stands for something, that they want their values to be aligned with them, right? And so you're seeing more and more organizations really take that into account in terms of the recruitment. And in fact, you know, um, really making that a strategic priority, becoming an employer of choice, can really have a significant positive impact in just in your recruitment alone, in your recruitment efforts, right? Because people are going to start seeing themselves in your brand, in your messaging, in the potential of working with you. So again, this is an area where um, some of these strategies and approaches can really help unleash the power of DEI and your human resources. The next application is DEI and C-suite leadership. You can look at these frameworks to really help build continuous leadership development. If you're looking at co-creating organizational cultures of belonging, um, you can actually, we've worked with a couple of clients that have really decided to customize leadership competencies around DEI. So again, data management is probably one of the best examples we can give. Is that when we sort of really looked at in this organization, if we bring a DEI lens to their data priorities, what's the competency? How do they train their C-suite leaders in terms of how to look at data? Um, so, and then finally, again, DEI Unleashed can really have a huge role in your C-suite teams, because it really speaks to understanding and managing organizational equity power. Makes them effective leaders, supervisors, managers. It can have so much impact in terms of the culture and the environment that you're setting. DEI and branding, and this is probably a little bit less talked about, and I would love to talk more about it, but we only have a few minutes left. But if you look at these DEI strategies and approaches that we discussed, they have so much implication in terms of your positioning and branding messages. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about an entire branding campaign, which is something you can do, right? But if you already have some of your brand defined, but you're looking at making tweaks, you're looking at making some adjustments, or even adjusting some of your core messages or positioning. Some of these frameworks have the potential to vastly impact the effectiveness of your branding activities. And again, if you go back to look at aligning some of your cultural humility and branding, right? In particular, storytelling and narrative change. Those strategies in DEI can really help position and expand your branding, and give you great data in terms of how to, what to add to your branding, how to position it. And then what we have here is also, we're seeing more and more healthcare organizations and social service organizations really looking at DEI and branding to become a provider of choice, right? And the strategies that they're using are storytelling and narrative change, and maybe some others, right? We are coming towards the end of the webinar here. If there's any component of here that you'd like to learn more about, we can send you some resources. We're happy to hop on the phone with you, a 30-minute phone call, no obligations. And we can just send you some more resources of what to look at, what to look for, and sort of how you can really unleash some of these potentials. So what we're hoping we did today was to really have you think more broadly about DEI and really beyond the sort of the strategy that we've looked at, where it's just sort of the traditional um, planning and assessment cycle and policies, but really looking at how it can be a DEI lens can really, a DEI strategic lens, excuse me, can really be applicable to so many aspects of your organization and really help differentiate it and advance your mission and priorities. Again, if you'd like to learn more, you can get in touch with us. We have an Instagram account now and LinkedIn. You can also visit our website, or you can email me, and you contact us through any of these mechanisms. We're happy to respond to your questions, send you some more resources, what have you. So thank you for sticking with us through the end of this webinar. We hope to stay in touch. One final plug, we are having a storytelling and narrative change webinar on May 30th. I may have jumped the gun. I think we're going to start promoting that next week, but in any case, you heard about it here, get it on your calendars, and we will see you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.